Good evening. This is the meeting of the Valley Stream Book Club. We are meeting today on February 24th, um, and we are going to be discussing the book Are You Happy by Laurie Ostlund. She is coming to us from San Francisco, I believe, so she's not experiencing our blizzard here. And as I had mentioned before, I am in two sweaters and a scarf because there's no heat in the library right now. So, um, we are going to start then with a little introduction from Lori, and then hopefully we'll open the floor to questions and discussion, and I will be monitoring anyone else who comes in. Okay, so Lori, will you tell us a little about yourself? And you're the first person we've ever had, author we've ever had that wrote short stories. So it's a little bit different for us.
Oh, interesting. Okay. I was actually really happy when you wrote and asked me to talk about a story collection because story collections um, are hard. People, I think book clubs, I spoke to a book club early last year, and they said they rarely do story collections. And I've had other story writers who've told me the same thing. So I'm very pleased that you decided to do my story collection. I'm actually curious to know whether there's a reason that you don't normally do story collections. Um, I don't know if people want to kind of pop in and offer some thoughts on that.
Well, I know that 90% of the time, I am the one that's selecting the books. They come across my desk. Many of them are more recent publications, and then I reach out to authors. Um, a lot of these story collections that come across, um, I guess there are many collections that are from well-known authors like Joyce Carol Oates or something like that.
Mm.
So, we're more focused on her fiction
Hmm.
novels, and yours was a little bit different. So that's why I selected it. Um,
Okay.
yeah, I don't know
Okay.
how if any of my other audience people normally read
Yeah.
short stories, so hopefully
So,
someone will chime in. Yeah. It's a different
Well,
genre because
nobody,
I think. Oh, go ahead, Irving.
nobody wants to write a short story. They all think that authors can write large novels when they start. And really, they should start with short stories because they're concise and they can get the point across. But they want to write a novel instead.
yeah.
And they
Yeah.
start that way and then they have a total failure because they can't write a novel the first time.
I think I mean that's interesting. You're thinking of a short story as kind of like you commit less time to it, and so if it all
No,
goes
you have to be
to
a good
hell.
author to write a short story because you have to do it in a format that's very tight.
Hmm.
Well, if they start with a novel, they're all over the place with all their ideas, and
Yeah,
that's very difficult to put it
yeah,
all together for the first time.
yeah,
Or if you write a novel, it would take you a lot longer to think the problem out and then to create it because you have different stories going on at the same time. Well, a short story doesn't have that problem. And I think it's a discipline that will allow you to write longer books with
yeah,
a few short stories together tied up.
yeah, yeah. They are. I will say, as somebody who writes, my first book was a story collection. My second book was a novel. My third book, this one, was a story collection. And my fourth book, which I was working on just before I joined all of you, is a novel. And so I kind of go back and forth between them. And they're very different things to write. They're just very different. I think novels are messier and more forgiving. I think that's kind of the point you're making about them, Irving. And sometimes that messiness is people can get lost in it.
It's
I'm,
unrewarding.
it's what?
It's unrewarding because they get lost all over the place, and nobody wants to read that garbage.
Do you prefer short stories? Barbara, you kind of came on. Do you have a thought about it and a preference?
Uh, I thought that short stories was a good switch from what all the other books we've been reading. Uh, I say the second one about uh, the couple with the child, where
Hmm.
the mother was so focused on keeping him safe, and the father who tried to control his nerves so that he could enjoy his son. It
Yeah.
was really, really touching. And the fact that in just a couple pages you could switch back and forth between the time periods and everything, I thought was done excellently.
Thank
Uh,
you.
I know a lot of my friends were reading all these books and they have trouble in a novel with all that switching
Mm,
time periods, and the fact that you could keep everything in track, and just the sensitivity and the emotion going. I thought that was really amazing.
thank you. That was why several of the stories in this book, normally with the short story, the idea is that it's supposed to play out over a very short period of time, an hour or a week. And a lot of these stories, I became interested in kind of, well, novelistic short stories that were spanning a long period of time, like the gap year that you're talking about, Barbara. And and that was tricky because it is short. It's still, 25 pages long. And how do you keep people from being confused? How do you move back? How do you structure it? And the biggest problem, I think, or the biggest question for me was how do you keep from just summarizing? Because suddenly you're looking at the scope of their relationship, 20 years together. And you can't just summarize it and say, and then this happened, and then this happened, and then this happened, because nobody wants to read summary. It's not interesting. And so that became the biggest question for me was how to take the parts of their life that really felt relevant to what you really nicely described as these very two different ways of looking at being a parent that brought them together, trying to control everything versus not ever wanting to talk about, just so that became for me, and I decided to write them as scenes and then move them around, put them in different, number them and put them in different orders to just see how they work together when they were juxtaposed. So how one piece kind of informed the next piece, even though they weren't happening in the same time frame. Um, and that was one of the earliest pieces I wrote in the book. And I wrote it, I thought it was finished. And I kept sending it out, and editors kept saying, we like the story, but I don't know, it's just, and I showed it to a friend and she said, it's everything here is in the past. I didn't have the last scene yet, where the two of them sit down in the hallway and talk together at the very end. And she said, everything here is in the past. And when you can't have a story only that's already settled. The reader has to have this sense of what's going to happen, what's unsettled. And so she said, I like it. It's just that, everything is already settled. And that's all she needed to say. And I sat down the next day and I wrote that final scene where he comes home and finds her. She's in the hallway. And that would move them forward in this kind of present toward an understanding that probably things would get better, but they would never be the same.
So it was a good collection. I still have two more to read, the last two. It's the first book that I read actually as a book since I had one of my eyes fixed from with cataract surgery.
Uh,
So
oh,
and I still can't see straight, but the doctor said, give it another month.
Uh, wow, that makes it hard for reading.
That and the computer.
Oh.
Yeah,
So Lori, okay,
yeah.
when you put these stories together, did you have like an outline of how this was going to progress? Were certain things thrown away that didn't fit, or you know, this it
Hmm.
seems like not only are each short story its own entity, but to put it together is a monumental task.
It is. I mean, that is always one of the big questions with story collections. And usually when I'm putting them together, I just think I mean, in this way, I think maybe about marketing because I think if somebody just opened this book in the store to the first story, is it a voice that people would be able to feel at ease with? Would they move into it easily? Because
How
there are
did
some,
you did you interview people who came out of a plane crash and survived? I mean, I
oh,
thought that was so, you
the
know,
title story, you
yeah.
know, years ago. So my wife's family, her father was Russian. They were Jewish, and so they left and went to Germany and then to France and finally to the United States. But they had relatives who remained behind in Russia. And one of these relatives, her aunt, Natasha, was finally able to come to the United States, and she married this guy Joey, and they came to stay with us years ago. And my wife's name is Anne. They came to stay with us in Albuquerque when we were living there. And one night at dinner, Natasha, who was also there with her best friend, told me this story. And the story was that they were flying, they were in Spain and they were getting ready to fly home. They were at the Canary Islands, I think. And the plane took off and it fell straight backwards. And so Natasha and her friend Gita and Gita's grown son, who was with them, were toward the front because they didn't smoke. But their friends that they were on vacation with were in the back of the plane because they were smokers and they died. And so when the shuttle took them to the hotel, the three of them got out and went, and they all climbed into this king size bed and they stayed there for 3 days. And the story just so stuck with me. And so I did what I usually do, which is that I kind of made notes about it. And then several years later, I hate to fly. I was flying to Boston, and I thought, if I write a story about a plane crash while I'm on the plane, it can't crash because the logic of that is certainly that's the way to keep the plane afloat. So I scribbled this story, the rough, outline of a story that based on what Natasha and Gita had told me these years earlier. And then I put it away. It served its purpose. The plane didn't crash. I got to Boston. I came home safely, put the notebook away, and came across it years later when I was cleaning my desk and thought, there's really a story here. And then it was just figuring out, for me, it's always figuring out how one story is intersecting with another story. And that was what I had to figure out was how this past story, and eventually I realized that it was really the story of a son and a mother. So, but it started out with this, as most of my stories do. They start out with something that happened or that someone told me, but then it's figuring out how to write it as fiction, not to just play over and over what happened, because I know what
Hmm.
happened. And that's not, I always assume if it's in my head and it stayed with me, it's because there's something else I'm trying to understand, some kind of truth. You
Right. Well,
know.
my husband never liked smokers when he was growing up. and he never sat in the Long Island Railroad car. If someone was smoking, he said, you got to go to the smoking car and whatnot. And when the mother was in the restaurant and didn't like the people smoking at the next table, and then here these people burned up in the smoke from the
Yeah.
crash, and they were the smokers. It was,
Yeah.
it's amazing. I know my granddaughter, she was just talking to me, and she's like 23 or 24 now. And she just finished some long series. She said 14 books she had to read, and it's mythical and all these
Oh,
things. And, I mentioned to her she could read a short story book and she'll like it, and it's much less time.
yes, it's
So,
much less
but the
time.
current generation, that's all they're reading about is fantasy and
Fantasy, fantasy is
kingdoms and
popular.
wars. And here she's going for her PhD in chemistry, and this is what she's reading.
Oh, okay. She's relaxing, I guess, right? Because chemistry, so she's relaxing. So,
Yes.
yeah. So, well, what other questions? It's nice to kind of, I'm happy to talk about anything, but
I
questions.
have a question for you about your family. Are you from a large family? Did your family dynamics get melded into the stories somehow?
Yeah, I grew up in a family with five children, so I guess that's large by today's standards. And I grew up, as I said, I don't write fact. There's a reason I don't write nonfiction. I prefer fiction. Um, but I pull from what I know. And what I know is that I grew up in a town of 400 people in Minnesota, and my parents had a hardware store. And so we didn't leave this small town except to go to the hardware convention once a year. That was a one-day event. So we just stayed, and it taught me, I think what it taught me more than anything was kind of restraint, how dialogue works, how emotion works, that you can't just say that something's sad. You can't just say that your character is crying or that, because readers don't feel sad if you tell them it's sad. Just like, if a comedian tells you that something is funny, you don't laugh. We tend not to laugh at a comedian who laughs at their own jokes. It somehow destroys that. And so the place that I grew up was a kind of a Scandinavian enclave. Most of the people there were from Norway, Sweden, some Finns, some Germans, some Poles. And so my family, my father was Swedish, my mother was Norwegian and Swedish, and that was the world that I grew up in. And I didn't know that it was its own kind of peculiar place because I had nothing to measure it against until I left. And so I think that my job has always felt like I am trying to interpret this place, and it's a place where emotions not spoken of, things are very restrained, and that kind of informed the way that I write dialogue, if nothing else, because most times when people are speaking of something, the important stuff is always silence, right? So they'll be talking, but then when they get to the thing that's really what they really are trying to talk about, they stop and there's silence, and then they pick up somewhere else. And as a kid, of course, I was fascinated by this because I was very shy and I worked in the hardware store. We all did. We worked in the hardware store. And I mainly was just listening and eavesdropping and learning about the way people talked about things and what it meant when people stopped talking. And that, yeah, that was my world. Then I went away to college, 2 years, 2 hours up the interstate to a state school. And that I think is where I realized I wanted to be a writer. I'd started out I always liked math. And so I think everyone thought that I would do something with math. And but I really loved reading. I didn't want to be an English teacher, but I really loved reading. I loved writing. And I was interested in people, but I was very, very shy. My parents always worried um, that I was too shy for the world. And so I got my first car when I was 20, and this crazy, but I started going out at night and I would pick up hitchhikers. And and nothing, it could have gone very badly, but I was curious about people. And so I would go out, and of course, it was a college town. So mainly I was just like a free taxi for drunk college students. But there were a couple of times. Once there was this older man, and he was, looking in the liquor store window, and the liquor store was closed in Minnesota, but it was a twin city. So one city was Minnesota, the other was North Dakota. And in North Dakota, they had more lenient hours when it came to package stores for liquor. So he looked very sad. And I said to him, I have a car, I can take you to North Dakota. And so he said, okay. He had his favorite, he had the whiskeys that he wanted. So I drove him to North Dakota. He went inside his liquor store. He came back with all of his whiskey, and I drove him back to Minnesota. And that was it. But I always carried a tape recorder in the car, those little tape recorders, because I thought that people would tell me things. And then after they got out, I would record what they'd said. And in this way, I would become a writer. This is what I thought. And of course, there was no conversation. Um, and I never used the tape recorder, but I always think of it as this pivotal moment, this first moment of thinking, I will be a writer. I want to know about the world. I want to know what people think.
Did you find that maybe you had a story and you kind of got to completion, but as you wrote, then you had to go back and like, is it an ongoing process?
Oh, it's completely. I have stories that I'm patient. I'm a very patient person, but I have stories that 10 years before I figure them out. A lot of times it's that I can't figure out how they end. Endings are very, very tricky. And so I'm patient. I just put them away because you know that the ending is somewhere in the story. And you can try to go back and read it, but what I've finally realized is that often I don't know how to end a story because there's something I don't understand yet. Maybe I haven't had a certain experience I need to have, um, that I need to go out in the world. My wife always says, just get away from the computer and go to a museum, go take a walk. And that's really the best thing but I resist it. I always think if I just sit here, then I'll come up with the ending that I need. So yes, the stories go through numerous. I don't have, I'm not someone who outlines with with writing. There are those who outline, and there are those who just sit down and write and see where it takes them. And that's the sort of writer I am. And so there's a lot of what some would call wasted time. I don't think of it that way, but I'm always trying to figure out how the pieces connect and why my mind thought, well, this piece goes with this piece goes with this. And yeah, and that's the process. And if I don't know the answer, you know, with my first collection, the title story was called The Bigness of the World. And I could not figure out the ending of it. And finally, one day, Anne said, let's just go to the ocean. Let's drive down to Point Lobos down near Carmel and just, look at the sea lions. And so we went, and when we were there, and said, your mother should come and visit us. My mother still lives in Minnesota and has never really gone, far away from that world that I lived in, has never been to California where I live. And so this just struck terror into me. I said, why would she come and visit us? And she said, how can you understand the bigness of the world if you haven't seen the ocean? She should see the ocean. And which is true because and so at this moment, we went home, and the next day we were getting the oil changed, and we're taking a walk. They're changing the oil, and suddenly I said, we have to go home right now because I understand the ending of that story, and I understand what the book is about. The book is about the bigness of the world. It's about that phrase, and it's because I remember the first time I saw the ocean. There are very few things that make you aware of how big the world is, and I think the ocean is one of them. And the first time I saw the ocean, I was in my early 20s. And I remember that feeling. I thought this could either be completely overwhelming or it could be so inviting. And that I realized was what the book was about, people who look at the world's bigness and feel afraid and retreat, and others who see the world's bigness and want to go out into it. And I understood both of those feelings. I think I always wanted to go out into it. But that was a case of, we left the oil changing shop. I just said, give us the car. And we went home, and I went up to my study and wrote the ending of that story. And I said, this is what the book is about. This is to kind of come back to that question that you asked earlier about how a collection comes together. It was the cohesion, because it wasn't just the ending for that story. It was the piece that pulled the whole book together.
It seems to be a very complicated process. So when you turn to, like, are you taking a year, 2 years? Did you put it aside and then come back? I mean, to get it all to gel.
For each story, I mean, each story is different. I have had stories that come together quickly. For me, quickly would be a matter of months, but that's rare. This, Are You Happy? The very first stories I wrote I was living in Chapel Hill. I was the visiting writer there for 2 years. And the first story, that was 2010 to 2012. So that's when I started some of the first stories in there. Clear as Cake, The Gap Year, go back to that period. And then the last three stories were The Bus Driver, which is the first story, The Stalker, and the final story. And those stories were just written in the last several years, though the last one, which is the novella, Just Another Family, that took years. I thought it was going to be a much shorter story, and then I put it away and thought, well, maybe I'll just never write again. I think many people felt that way during the pandemic. And then kind of came out of it with a much different feeling. And one day just thought, I'm ready to write again. And I sat down and just on a tear finished that story, turned it into a novella. So the collection really, in its entirety, the stories were a dozen years in the writing, probably 12, 13 years.
When did you
Yeah.
know you were finished?
That's always the question. With the collection itself or with each story?
I mean, when did you know you were finished with the collection?
I think I knew that I was finished. I thought, okay, this is a good number of stories, especially because the last one is longer. So it's the right number of stories. I'm also, one of my jobs is that I'm the series editor for the Flannery O'Connor Award. So every year I choose the winning collection for that. And in the process, I read 35 story collections. And so I have this sense from that of what makes a cohesive collection, what starts to feel unwieldy, where I just feel like the author put in every story that they wrote and it kind of becomes this long, disconnected sort of thing. So I knew that I was looking at certain themes. I always kind of have certain things I'm interested in. One of them is loneliness, and that was the theme that I was looking at throughout. Another one was the theme that they kind of talk about on the cover, which is the specter of violence. And so I realized that maybe half the stories deal with something awful that's happened.
Mm. The
And
one about the
that,
bus. Oh, I don't want to interrupt. Oh, wait.
yeah. So, but the story we talked about earlier that you brought up, Barbara, the gap year is like that. The bus driver is like that. And so they're the sorts of events that kind of split life into a before the event and an after.
The bus driver, you know, it was sort of, it really upset me about the justice in it.
Mhm.
Eventually, the bus driver and
Yeah.
the coach was dead, and yet the friend of the bus driver's daughter and her mate, started talking about justice. And, you knew the father wanted to kill him all this years ago, and maybe you should go to the police now and say you knew about this from years ago. And I said, that's not justice anymore.
Yeah. Yeah.
It bothered me that
Yeah.
if
Well,
that
that
long,
was, go ahead,
I
Barbara.
just didn't like the ending. I mean, I thought that you shouldn't have put that question in. It was a done deal. It
I
happened
think,
by coincidence and leave it at that.
yeah, I think Chekhov wrote in a letter one time that the objective of a writer is not to answer questions, but to ask questions well. And with that story, I very much wanted to ask that question. What is justice? Is it ever a clear-cut thing? Because I'm not sure that it is. And what's been interesting to me, I think, one of the things about having a book out and talking to people about it and going out on tour is learning what the book is about. Because I have one idea of what I was thinking about, and then I go and talk to people, and that's when I really learn about the book. And that story has been interesting because most people do not believe that the narrator of that story will call the police the next day. But some do. And that question of what it means and what and why is always an interesting one for me. Um, because I'm not sure that the world's spinning ever closer to justice. And especially, I think, for some people more than others. I mean, this is what she's grappling with her friend, is whether that ever happened, whether her friend ever got any sort of justice. So,
It made you
but
think the book, which is good.
yeah, I mean that was a difficult piece for me to write because it's based on something that happened when I was a teenager and that I waited many years to write about until I had a certain distance from it. And anyway, so to go back to your question, Carolyn, I basically once I realized what my theme was, that I had some stories that were about a tragedy or something that had happened, and we were watching how that affected people. But the other half of the stories are about kind of that specter of violence, the things that feel like they're going to happen and they never do. And that's a whole other thing when you something almost happened. And so that became what I was interested in writing about also, and that kind of bound the book together. And I'm a slow writer. And when I looked at what I had, these were the stories that kind of felt like they worked together around that.
Did you ever bump into a teacher named Elizabeth Steiner from New York, from Long Island?
No, no.
Was one of them, we had a 50th year reunion from high school, and
Mhm.
one of the women that I went to school with for, 13 years from kindergarten till we graduated, and we each went our separate college ways. And she wound up in as a college English professor
Mhm.
in Minnesota.
Oh, in Minnesota. I left Minnesota many years ago. So
But
yeah,
maybe you met her when she was young.
yeah, yeah, the name's not familiar, but maybe. What other questions do people have or other
Um,
thoughts?
so I have a question about your short stories. Do you ever think that you'd make a novel out of any of them? Like expand, or is this kind of just one and done?
I feel as though stories and novels are different. With a story, when I start writing something and I think to myself, this is a story, it's often because it's kind of picking apart of something very specific. I don't see it in terms of something bigger. But I will say that there is one of the stories in there, the Peeping Toms, which is one of the seeds for the novel that I'm working on now, which will be my next book. And it's based on the years that my wife and I owned an Asian furniture store in New Mexico called Two Serious Ladies. And I thought, what would happen if I took all of the kind of unsettling things that happened over the course of those 7 years, from peeping toms to, just all sorts, and I compressed them into half a year, and then brought my my wife's grandmother, who used to live with us for part of the year, into it because she was a force to be reckoned with. And so,
She was amazing. I mean, with her broken hip and drinking a tablespoon of water.
yeah, yeah, she was something. And that was, she died when she was 101. She'd actually moved to Long Island from from New York, which is where she lived when they came to this country for many years. She lived in New York, and then when she was, around 90, she moved to Long Island and bought a house and got, at the age of, I think, 95, bought this house. And so her final years were spent in Long Island, but she would come and stay with us from time to time and broke her hip. And so that was kind of, and at the same time, we had a peeping Tom. And so again, it was, I'm always looking with short stories. There's kind of what's happening on the top story, which is, the plot. But there's something floating underneath the bottom story, and that's what makes it the story. That's, if it's only top story, you just have an anecdote. But it's that bottom story that figuring out how to bring that to the surface and give shape to that. That's the thing that I'm always thinking about. And the only way I know how to do that is to take seemingly disparate pieces and kind of let them interact with each other to see what happens. But if I just go chasing after the plot, I end up without a story. So yeah, so that one, Regina, to answer your question, is becoming a novel, though it was really just the seed. Even when I wrote that story, I thought I had much more to say about this period of time. So
Did you get involved with the native Indians there? Because we
in
had
New
read
Mexico.
another book about the photographer who took pictures of for the sheriff's department, and she was remember that one?
Ramona Emerson.
Yeah,
Ramona.
Oh, it was called
And
Shutter.
right. She took
Shutter,
the
yeah.
pictures.
what is the author's last name?
I'm trying,
Emerson.
Emerson.
Eberson. No, I don't know that author.
Yeah, she took the pictures of these crime scenes, and because of her Native Indian heritage, she could see their lives or something and help the police solve the murders,
Oh,
mysteries.
interesting.
But she also, in her book, also said how, the culture was still against the Native Indians. They were wrong still. And that impressed me. So I was kind of happy to be back in Albuquerque again to see a little bit more about what's going on there.
Yeah, Albuquerque is an interesting place. I lived there for 15 years. And I think it's an unlikely place to set a book. It's, when people think of New Mexico, they always think of Santa Fe. And I like Santa Fe, it's nice. But for me, Albuquerque is kind of the beating heart of that state. It's just the real town. So,
And they have a lot of artists that go there. I've met a bunch of them in North Carolina that came from Long Island, but they had all the jewelry and told me about how, you make it and polish stones and all this other stuff. So, uh, it introduced me to the other culture in Albuquerque.
yeah, yeah. Yeah, Albuquerque is a very interesting place. I'm curious, so are any of the people here tonight also writers?
We have someone who
Readers.
who has been writing, but she couldn't make it today, and she was a little disappointed. Since we share the recording, I'm sure she's going to be very interested in it. She's in the process of writing. Her name is Sue, and it's um it's been a long time. She's written short stories actually and won some contests. And when she tried to put together her book, it's she was not able to get an agent and some, to really push it. I'm a little, I'm always interested in that. Was your first published work really the novel or the short stories? I know that you've written in many journals and stuff.
Yeah. Well, my first book, so first of all, short story collections are notoriously difficult to get published. Um, that's just a whole, right now I'm putting together a panel about that very topic, about just people's fear of short story collections, which is why I asked everyone in the beginning about whether it was unusual to be reading a short story collection and why that was. Um, so my first book was the story collection, The Bigness of the World, and that won the Flannery O'Connor Prize, which is how it ended up getting published. And when it was published, an agent contacted me, and that agent became my agent, who then sold my second book, which was a novel. And then during the pandemic, I broke up with that agent. I'd been with her for years, but the pandemic it took its toll on people. And um, I needed an agent, and she was not in a position to be an agent then. So I was in the worst possible situation one could be, which is that I was back out looking for an agent with a story collection, because what I had finished was a story collection. And that's just, agents don't want to mess with story collections. But I was fortunate. I got a great agent. He was my first choice, Henry. And he has been wonderful. And when he read the collection, I said, I don't know what it should be titled. And he said, well, his favorite story in the collection was Are You Happy? And he said, I think that's also the title that fits the collection, because I was trying to get I was reading through the other titles thinking, well, would one of these work? And he said, no, Are You Happy? And that I am indebted to him for that, because that title has served me really well. I have to say. So But it is difficult. I'm not surprised to hear that Sue has found that difficult because it's just it's hard with the story collection.
So obviously you are um you're successful being an author, but I had mentioned before, you're not like the James Patterson writing a book and making millions and millions of dollars.
Yeah.
So you're also editing. You said the Fl the Flannery Connor Award or something.
Yeah, the Flannery O'Connor Award for short fiction. So there are a handful of um, story prizes for story collections, and the Flannery O'Connor is maybe the best known just because Flannery O'Connor kind of changed the landscape when it came to short stories. And the University of Georgia Press runs that prize. And truly, they just thought, well, we're in Georgia and, Flannery O'Connor lived down the road. We'll just reach out to her, to her estate and see if they would mind the prize being named after her. And they were on board with it. And so it has nothing to do with her estate or with her, but that became the name of the prize. And it's been around for, I don't know, 40 or 50 years. So that is what I do. I've cycled through a lot of jobs. I'm always doing different things. So I'm the Flannery O'Connor series editor. I'm a developmental editor. For years, I was on faculty at a MFA program. They laid all of us off in one swoop a couple of years ago. And yeah, I do a lot of different things. And that's, I think, pretty typical. I don't, my options are limited because I don't have an MFA. And so I'm not able to teach in any program that is part of a public university. Although University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill did take me on for those 2 years, and they said they didn't care. But normally that's the case, and they're not going to take the rules of the university are that you need to have a terminal degree, and I don't have one. I have a
You still
master's.
have time.
Yeah, I always felt my education happened in a different way. I did my master's degree in literature, and then I thought I won't do academia. I grew up in a you know, that small world in academia. I think I wrote in one of my stories. Felt like it could become for me another small world, and because I grew up in a town of 400 people, I just wanted to be out in the world. And so I finished my master's degree, and then we moved to Spain for 2 years, and then back to New Mexico, and then we moved to Malaysia for 2 years, back to New Mexico, and then here, and that, and just kind of, and that has always felt more like what I wanted to do in terms of writing. It suited me better, I think. So, Irving, I feel as though you had your hand up at one point.
Yes, my question was partly answered, I think. Are you able to sleep at night without having all these things popping in and popping out? You
Yeah,
never remember your dreams?
yeah. I sleep better some nights than others. Yeah, but I'm not someone who gets up in the middle of the night and writes. Right now, I'm in a period of, because I have the house to myself. And, normally we have my wife's here, she's not here, she's in Canada, and we have a lot of young people because we have sponsored refugees, and so they've been living with us. And then our last young person was an asylum seeker. So we have a small house. It's 800 square feet. And so there's not a lot of room to get away from people. And so right now for 10 days, 12 days, I have the place to myself. So I'm meant to get a lot of writing done.
Well,
And
what I mean is, When you get
Yeah.
up in the morning, do you remember your dreams and then try to write them down?
No, I don't like dreams. I always tell people don't tell me your dreams.
Okay.
I don't. I get up very early. I get up between 4 and 5. And I read the New York Times, I do the crossword puzzle, all of those sorts of things. And then when my coffee's done, I start writing. And I like to be still a little bit foggy brained, but I don't want my dreams. I don't know, I feel like my dreams are a little bit too on the nose. And the only dreams I remember, honestly, are the ones that are kind of anxiety dreams. And my anxiety dreams are always about being in the classroom because when you're a teacher, all of your anxiety dreams are about being in a classroom.
So the other question is, do you have a steady job?
Well, define steady. I
I
have,
mean, where you know you're going to get your paycheck at the end of the
sure.
week.
I am always, every time we apply for a mortgage or need to redo paperwork, I'm always the nightmare because my paperwork is very cobbled together. I do a lot of things, nothing's ever steady. One year I could sell a book and then I have a very nice paycheck to show, and then the next year things are looking very, in fact, when I won the Flannery O'Connor Award, I was 44, almost 45. And just before I won it, I quit writing. I was out taking a walk one day and I just said to Anne, you know what? I'm not an idiot and I work very hard. And those two things combined in any other profession would translate into a certain degree of, you know, career stability, and that would have some sort of a financial benefit.
So that's the third question. Do you write full time and avoid employment in anything else?
No, I'm always so so that when I quit teaching, I decided I would become a paralegal. And so started paralegal school, and you know the way these things work. The day I started, I came home and I had a message from the Flannery Prize telling me I'd won. So then I couldn't quit. And I wouldn't have quit anyway. But I have always cobbled things together. I'm not, fortunately, I am not someone who's um, so interested in money that that becomes its own. There are other things that I am much more interested in. When my students ask me how to become a better writer, I always say, if it makes you a better person, it will probably make you a better writer. And for me, that has been finding meaningful work, having a community, being curious about the world, and finding a way to change the world, to do something that makes the world better. So I've always been involved in a lot of volunteer work, which is work, it's not paid work. And what I'm always thinking about is just how to always be just stable. I don't need a lot of money.
So
So
how did you convince them
fortunate.
to give you a mortgage?
How do I?
How did you convince them to give you a mortgage?
Well, I do make
Bank,
some money.
a bank likes to know that they're going to get paid in the future.
Yeah, you know what? I have a very, very good credit score. So that helps. And I think that that would also probably mean that I do make some money. And and with that money I pay my bills, including my mortgage. So,
It's a
and
tough
the more,
life. It's a
pardon,
tough life.
is
It's a
what?
tough life. It's not an easy life.
No, it's not any,
Yeah.
it's been, actually, I don't regret any part of it. I don't regret any part of it. I am much, much better off than so many people. That is for sure. And, there are things that I have to do. What I understand about myself is that in order to write, even though my writing is not always at time, I always say that I'm a funny, sad writer. And that in order to do that, I have to feel hopeful in some way. I don't write well if I don't feel hopeful. And so for me, I feel hopeful because I'm a Midwesterner. I feel hopeful if I'm doing useful things. So part of my life is always doing those things, and it takes away from my writing. It honestly does. But it also gives me something to write about. And this has worked, you know. Listen, I'm 2 months away from paying off my mortgage. So once that happens, then the next step will be now I can work even a little bit less and write a little bit more. And that for me is cause for celebration.
Thank you for sharing that with me.
Yeah.
Laurie, I want to thank you so much for coming and sending. It's almost an hour, so unless anyone else has anything else, I don't want to keep you much longer. But I think that your your attitude is, I mean, maybe is the reaction from growing up in a small town of 400 people that you really weren't, you wanted to look elsewhere.
Yeah. Yeah. I think that that's true. Thank you so much for having me. I really appreciated hearing everybody's comments and questions. And
Thank you so much. And does anyone else have any last minute questions or comments? And otherwise, I don't want to keep you much longer. And we're looking for your next book. Then what is the timeline? Is that going to be a couple more
well,
years?
it's due. So when I sold Are You Happy? It was a 2-book deal. And the next book, as soon as I turned in my final edits for Are You Happy? The clock started, and I had 2 years from the time I turned that in, and those 2 years expire January 1st, which is why I'm here in hiding and trying to finish it. And I think that the timeline is that if everything goes to plan, it will be a year, it will come out a year after that. So it will come out like summer, fall 2027. So yeah. Anyway, I hope all of you, I hesitate to tell you that it was around 60 something here today in San Francisco. And there was no snow, but I'm from Minnesota, so I do understand snow. And I know I know how you all are feeling. So stay warm and thank you all for inviting me.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Bye.
Bye.
Okay. I'm going to stop the recording. Thank you very much.